Hi everybody, this is my essay segment 1 draft, beginnings. The year is 1963, the place is somewhere between Bloomington and Clear Creek, Indiana. I am 8 years old, and I'm busying myself by drawing submarine plans in an empty bank book that I've been given. Inspired by Jacques Cousteau's underwater habitats and diving saucers, I am sketching out my version of them. I anticipated that my alter ego avatar, Elmo, number 99, would pilot my ungainly looking machines to new worlds deep under the sea and discover fantastic things. Elmo, number 99, was the star of many of my imaginings. Elmo was another name for the devil, not the evil kind of devil, just a red guy with horns. And 99, well, because 99 is just a cool number. One less than the magical 100, and with an alliterative nature that was irresistible to me. Elmo, number 99, was badass, and he was going places. As I planned out my conquest for inner space, I realized I was being watched. I think Mom related to my curiosity as she was going through her own phase of self-discovery. She had an easel and oil paints. She bought a $15 guitar from Sears. She did charcoal and pencil sketches and did things like fill up the bathtub with colored water and put plastic plants in it. These urges faded by the time I was a teenager, but for now it was the 1960s and she was 31 years old and happily exploring the arts. I looked up at her and she was holding a broken alarm clock. Mom was offering it to me for some reason, and initially I was skeptical. It was an old wind-up thing, round with a 6-inch face. It had 2 bells on top like the ones in the cartoons, but it didn't have an animated face with eyes, and I couldn't imagine it jumping up and down on the nightstand like the one in Tom and Jerry. "Have you ever wondered how these work?" Mom asked. "Not really," I responded, returning to my crude sketches. "Well, maybe you could take it apart and see." Now she had my attention. "I bet you'd be surprised what's inside." "How can we do that?" I asked. She directed me to some rusty tools from the basement toolbox, and I spent the next hour in the carport disassembling the West clocks. Tools were fairly new to me, but I was familiar with a hammer, so that was my primary implement. I was completely enthralled. Soon I was surrounded by gears, blue steel springs, hands, and other bits and bobs of this simple machine. Mom wasn't able to explain much about how it worked, except the mainspring, but her enthusiasm carried the day. "Isn't it amazing?" she gushed. "Did you ever think there would be so many parts and things inside a silly clock?" I had to admit it was pretty interesting. In fact, I was in awe. Designing submarines seemed ridiculous when even a stupid clock was complex beyond my imagining. It was a great afternoon. A couple of weeks later, I had forgotten about the episode, and she made an art project from those parts, gluing some of the gears, springs, and other parts onto a fabric background in a small frame. I still think of this episode as my earliest foray into machines and mechanics, and I would give anything to recover that initial sense of wonder for either of us. My first bicycle was a rusty turd that Dad bought from a classified ad in the newspaper for $5. It was of indeterminate color and very, very heavy. It was perfect for riding under the low-hanging tree branch in the neighbor's yard, which I would grab at the last moment, letting the bike go on without me, watching it as it crashed into a heap. Elmo, number 99, was impressed. Eventually, after multiple upgrades, I had a bicycle with actual gears and a banana seat. I was 12 by then and fancied myself as quite the bicycle mechanic. Along with some friends, we built Frankenstein bikes from all the spare parts lying around. Bikes with different size wheels on either end. High seats and low handlebars. Low seats and high handlebars. Tiny chain rings for super low gearing, which were better for peeling out. But eventually the various bicycle shenanigans became boring, and I encountered my first mini bike. These were crude little affairs with small fat wheels, no suspension, and a lawnmower type cast iron engine of 3 to 5 horsepower. Owning one not only placed you on a pedestal in the local social scene, but it also ensured lots of groovy scars, scabs, and embellished tales about how you got them. Dave Smith had a mini bike, and he was the envy of the neighborhood. He had disabled the governor on his machine and could reach a death-defying 25 miles an hour. Soon after, the Nicholson boys, whose family was rich by the standards of the day, got little Honda mini bikes. These were very much more sophisticated. They were practically motorcycles. One begged hard enough, they might even let you take a spin, but it was never enough for me. I ached for one of the little 50cc bikes. I wanted it so bad I couldn't stand it. It was more fun than I ever imagined possible, and life simply wasn't worth living if I couldn't have one. I begged, I cajoled, I was ready to sell my soul to the devil for some internal combustion. My parents scoffed, ultimately throwing down the gauntlet that if I wanted it, I would have to buy it myself. Stewart Speed and Sport was the local Honda dealer, the first in Indiana, though they sold a variety of other brands as well, and also guns. They were located in downtown Bloomington, about a 30-minute bicycle ride from where I lived. Once I reached junior high school, this place became a regular hangout for me and my motorhead friends. The low brick building set along Walnut Street with a row of used motorcycles lined up on the sidewalk out front. These were the main attraction, as I imagined that used was the only thing that a 13-year-old would ever be able to afford. Inside, the front half of the store was divided between the new motorcycle showroom and the gun store, and there was a parts counter in the back. The entire back half of the building was filled with dozens and dozens of non-working motorcycles and all sorts of other junk, along with a couple of repair benches. Alongside the building, in the parking lot, people were coming and going on motorcycles continuously, either taking test rides, coming in for parts, or just making the scene. Two-stroke dirt bikes would spring to life, their blue exhaust smelling as sharp and acrid as the ping-pop sound of their expansion chambers. By comparison, the big road bikes whirred in a civilized fashion. The Stewart brothers, Hank and Bob, split their duties. Bob, the younger of the two, basically ran the place, doing all the behind-the-scenes business stuff. Hank, who was probably in his 60s, worked the sales floor and tolerated we teenagers who were hanging about asking too many questions and never buying anything. Hank was stoutly built, cheerful, and seemed to always be chewing on a fat cigar butt, usually unlit. He would see us perusing the lineup of used bikes out front and come out and tell us what the latest machines they had gotten in were. Kawasaki Bighorn, he would start. Hank was never big on complete sentence. Damn thing had 10-speed gearbox. He talked around the cigar butt, only occasionally pulling it out so he could spit out some flake of tobacco. When you going to bring your folks down here? Hank asked, understanding all too well that the only way he was going to make a sale to any or me or my friends was if our parents were there. I don't know, I said, looking slightly embarrassed. You know, your buddy Steve Sparks came in and got himself a SL100 last week. What? I exclaimed, just a little too loud. This was too much. I wonder why Steve hadn't called me to let me know before realizing, oh yeah, he's out riding. Man, oh man, Hank, I gotta give me a bike. I tried not to sound whiny, but I'm sure my frustration came through. I'd been perusing used bikes twice a week for a month and could probably tell you everything about each one of them. Well, you know, Hank started, I do have a little something you might be able to afford. My eyes grew wide at this impossible hope. What do you mean? I don't see anything here. I told you I only have a couple $100. It was a lie. I barely had $100 saved from paper routes and lawn mowing. My allowance was $2 a week. So that didn't really count. It's in the back. Want to see it? Hank could see my growing excitement, so without another word, he began shuffling toward the entrance. I didn't even bother to lock up my bicycle. I was right behind him. The machine was a peculiar-looking thing, a Gorelli, which was not a brand I'd ever heard of, and no one I've ever met has heard of it either. It had 12-inch wheels, so it wasn't a mini bike, but it wasn't a full-fledged motorcycle either. It looked old and tired, but it did have some Italian style, and most importantly, it had an actual clutch and a 4-speed gearbox. Within a couple weeks, I handed Hank $135, and Dad and I loaded this nugget in the back of the car for the ride home. I was in heaven, and although this thing never ran for more than a couple of days at a time before it needed some work, it was mine. I had no license and no helmet, but no one seemed to care. Dave Smith and I would sneak through town via the alleyways until we got out to the countryside. There we would race along country lanes at what felt like breakneck speeds, only occasionally crashing and never getting too hurt. I felt complete. Later, my mother would create a lovely pencil and watercolor picture of the Grelly. It probably went to the same place as the clock art. 16-year-old, fully licensed me worked at a fast food place, flipping burgers and making Pappy Parker's fried chicken. This afforded me enough cash to buy records and motorcycle magazines, among other things. Although I now had my driver's license, I was relying on the kindness of strangers and parents to get around. It was 1972 and we had moved to the D.C. suburbs so my dad could make use of his new law school degree, achieved at age 40. Even as the Watergate scandal was unfolding, I hungered for wheels. The Northern Virginia suburbs were vast, and none of my wheeled conveyances had made it from Indiana, not even a bicycle. In retrospect, none of them were really worth bringing. But that didn't change the feeling of being an urge-filled teenager stranded somewhere west of Annandale. I hitchhiked a lot. That was pretty normal back then. One night, my parents went to see Ray Charles at Wolf Trap. It must have been their anniversary or something, and alas, they weren't going to be able to pick me up after work. So after much discussion, they decided to let me solo for the first time, using the second car, a 1966 VW Beetle. "Don't go anywhere to work and then come straight home," Dad warned. "And don't go picking up any friends and go joyriding." Of course, this is exactly what I did, and you can guess the rest. The crashed Beetle thus came into my possession. So my first car was also my first project car, given that it was no longer drivable. It sat on the patio for the summer, and I spent every cent that junior hot shops paid me on junkyard parts and tools. My father never passed up an opportunity to remind me how badly I had messed up. When Hurricane Agnes came up the eastern seaboard, I remember watching the water in the backyard rise, submerging my parts. I prayed that it didn't come over the door sills and flood the inside of the little car. Eventually, I got everything fixed up and would race around the neighborhood testing things. I didn't have insurance yet, so when the car was stolen out of the driveway, it was a big problem. Dad thought that I had somehow contrived to have the car stolen. Maybe hatched a plan with my long-haired dope fiend friends. To what end he imagined this would serve is still a mystery, but he dragged me out of bed one morning screaming at me about it, which was how I learned that my labor of love was gone. After throwing me around a little, he summarily shoved me into his car, and I was driven from one friend's house to another, where Dad stood on doorsteps and yelled at one set of parents after another in an impotent rage. The police found the shell of my car stripped 2 weeks later. I learned this from Mom because after the slap around, I left home. I had just turned 17, and I wouldn't see my father again for 3 years. Almost done. The pain was immediate and searing. I'd been lying under the rusty BMW for a couple hours and had suffered dirt falling in my eyes, busted knuckles, and a bruised knee. But now I had really done it. The 14-inch adjustable wrench that I was using as a breaker bar on an Allen key had slipped and hit me squarely in the forehead. As the stars cleared, I felt wetness, reached up and felt wetness, and I knew that it was not good. I didn't yell. I simply laid there on the concrete, waiting for my senses to return. Was I concussed? Had I peeled back a flap of scalp? Do I need to yell for my wife to come and take me to the ER? Thankfully, the damage was minor. A small 3-cornered tear right at my hairline. Initially bled profusely, but stopped with some pressure and ice. The knot was appreciable, but I'd had worse. I decided no on the ER and that stitches would be overkill. I was actually more concerned that the differential drain bolt was still not loose. Working on cars when you're 63 is way different than working on them when you're 23. Sure, I have more knowledge, tools, and capability, but my body rebels at working without a lift. And as we've just seen, judgment sometimes still fails me. It was at this point, 8 months in on my first real restoration, that I started having second thoughts. The 1987 BMW was a minefield of complex systems and unobtainable parts and expensive German leather. I had already poured thousands into it, and the end was nowhere in sight. I should just be collecting stamps, I thought to myself. Still, there's some magic in all this, the satisfaction that comes from small jobs like fixing a leaky hose fitting. And then doing something big for the first time ever, like replacing an entire interior. Those jobs take weeks of frustration and problem solving, but feel so good once checked off the list. I wish I could say that working on machines was somehow a metaphor of life, but the comparisons are shaky, so I won't. But I will say that spinning wrenches and obsessing over wheeled vehicles has been a true constant in my life. It's an obsession I only recognized in retrospect, and upon reflection, I still don't completely understand the attraction. It typically involves frustration, dirty fingernails, and lots of money, but the results can be gratifying. I think I do it more to prove to myself that I understand how things work, because that somehow gives me a sense of control. And Elmo 99 likes control.